Daniel Ellsberg, whose Pentagon Papers shook the American establishment and blazed a trail for the anti-Vietnam War movement, has died at 92. We look at the most prominent aspects of his legacy today on Daily Debrief. A pregnant woman's death sparks massive protests in Poland against the heavily restrictive abortion law. How did Poland get here? And what do women demand? We take a look. And finally, an update as geopolitical tensions continue to build in East Asia. Welcome to Daily Debrief. I'm your host Shriya, and these are the stories for the day. Millions of Americans opposed their country's prolonged war in Vietnam, but Daniel Ellsberg released the so-called Pentagon Papers that changed the course of that war. He exposed the media's ignorance of the role of the US government and its complicity in the extent of US involvement in Vietnam. The American government legally hounded Ellsberg for years. He firmly opposed oppressive American government tactics and its overwhelming paranoia about journalists, scholars, even ordinary citizens. Prabir Purkayastha, Editor-in-Chief, NewsClick, joins us in studio to discuss Ellsberg's legacy. Welcome back to the show, Prabir. So Daniel Ellsberg, few can match in history his role and his contribution. How do you define the role he played and his contribution in exposing the role of US Army in the war in Vietnam?
Well, before we go into that, I would like to share with you and our viewers what has been his role, not only in all of this that you've described, but as an example of what a committed person must do. And to that extent, he was an inspiration to our generation. Don't forget, we are the Vietnam generation in that sense. Vietnam was very important in our forming our political views, and also what we became as basically thinkers, actors, and as activists. And that, I think, the last part of it is the most important. The interesting part about Daniel Ellsberg is that we don't really have in this generation of people who have been inside the security apparatus of the US government, for example, and has come out of it and said what needs to be said. His real politicization was not simply the Vietnam War, but it was also the studies that the Rand Corporation, of which he was a part, and he had access to the highest levels of the US security because he had the rank within the security establishment, that of what would be in military terms something between lieutenant and a major general. So he had a very high security clearance, which is I think something of CS-18, so very high security clearance, and he was in his early 40s at the time. So he looked at these two things. One was the history of the Vietnam War, what is much more known for, but also he also looked at the nuclear war planning that both sides were doing, specifically a question which the then president had asked the security establishment: how many people will die in a nuclear war? And the numbers was something like 80 to 120 million. So this is the kind of numbers when he saw, this was a shock to him. And this is something which is not public. So it's very few people. In fact, the document said for the eyes of the president only, because he had asked this question. And that is why he was allowed to look at the answer. So this was to him an eye-opener, just as the Vietnam War was. Right. And it is the conclusions of the Rand Corporation study, which is what he leaked finally to the press, which is what caused his going to, being charged, going to prison for a short while, all of that, and launches his career as an activist. So that part of his trajectory of actually going to fight against war, that's something that came as a consequence of his being willing to take a position on this, taking the risk, and of course blowing up his career, which is what he did. So the interesting part about this, the Vietnam War Rand Corporation study had already said that this is not winnable, that we cannot win this war, but it continued for a number of years even after the conclusions of the study was known to the US administration. So that is why the cynicism of this is why Ellsberg decided that he had to come out in public. People were coming to the streets, people were fighting against it, he had to join them. So that was the changing, inspirational act that he did, which also meant that all of us got to know about him. And as you know, then there was Nixon trying to blame him for various things, saying this is all bogus, asking about his medical records, trying to make his medical records public, going against the newspapers, saying that you can't publish this, this is not possible, losing the case court. And then also what is the corresponding output of that, the Watergate scandal, which also started from what Daniel Ellsberg was doing. So this had consequences far beyond simple making certain things public. But the real inspiration of Ellsberg's life, he went on doing this all his life. He became an activist for peace. He participated in demonstrations. He wrote about it. But his biggest act, which he wanted to do, was to expose the atomic secrets. And he knew that if he made this public, what is now written as the Doomsday Machine, that if he could make those documents public, he would go to jail for life, probably. But he was willing to take that risk, except he wanted to wait for the Pentagon Papers to become public, that thing to blow over before he did this, except that in the process, by an accident, those papers got lost because he had given it to somebody who had stored it in a warehouse, and somehow it got destroyed in a storm or some bulldozer going over it. Something happened, the papers were lost, and he could recover only a few of those papers. But those documents are now public. So over the last 40 years, those documents have been public. And Ellsberg has written extensively on this. So inspirational life, because he could have been a very senior security officer in the United States, probably at the levels where he would have been national security advisor at a later stage, almost of that rank, and the fact that he was willing to put everything in his life at the service of what he believed in.
Right. So, in a way, what Ellsberg did open up ways for the media ways and tools for the media to expose oppressive state tactics. And was it especially relevant that, I think you addressed this earlier, was it especially relevant that he was American?
Well, it was the US security state, which was at the time at the forefront of the Cold War and the Vietnam War. So obviously it is something which only an American would have access to.
Yeah.
Okay. Particularly the Vietnam War, of course, but also the nuclear war. Do not forget that already the US had exploded 2 bombs on Japan. And the argument was that they would control the Cold War because of being the only nuclear armed state. Didn't continue. But the nuclear war, the plans for nuclear war, and the argument about with the first strike, if we strike the enemy first, can we defend ourselves against the second strike? This is what led to the nuclear arms race, continuously building up more and more weapons. The world, how many times can you destroy the world kind of race? And that was the Ellsberg question, which he asked at that time as a presidential query to the US security. Basically the defense forces, as it is called, that how many people would die in a nuclear exchange. And that figure was a frightening figure, which drove him to the conviction that nuclear bombs should never be used in a war, and therefore that is the anti-nuclear movement then, which he participated in. It was there, but this whole argument, of course, becomes strengthened by what is called the argument that if there is even a much lower level of nuclear exchange, consequence of that fact that 80 to 110, 120 million people will die, that was horrendous, and that shocked Ellsberg to the belief that nuclear weapons have to be stopped at all costs. But of course, he couldn't make that public. May have delayed the possible consequences of the nuclear war being so authoritatively known to the world, because that was an answer being given by the US Defense Department. So it was not just a conjecture of well-meaning peace activists. It could not be, if that had become public, it could not have been denied. But I think what happened was that this was much more starkly brought out when the climate change people got involved in it and said the consequence of a nuclear exchange would see the extinction of civilization as we know it because of the climatic effects of such a war, and the possibility therefore of a new cold era beginning, because the world would possibly freeze, consequence of the cloud of dust not letting sun come in, and so on. So the argument that this a nuclear exchange would kill off civilization as we know it has become or is now quite widely accepted, except that it doesn't stop people still making nuclear weapons and saying this is for peace. That is unfortunately the problem we still have. The nuclear weapons are very much there, and the nuclear disarmament process which had started, but at least scaling down the nuclear weapons, has come to a stop. No further steps are being taken in this direction, and in fact the nuclear accords which had been created in 80s and 90s actually are now falling or weakening. So we are still in the phase where Ellsberg would have said that our civilization is at danger and all of us need to act on it. That's why I think today when I hear about his death, of course this was expected because he was suffering from pancreatic cancer. He's 92 years old, so he was old, and he had said that he will not take any medication for it. He decided that, bad enough as pancreatic cancer is, the medicines would only prolong his agony. So he decided not to take medicine. But today is a time to really really acknowledge the role that he played, the inspiration that he was, and pay homage to somebody who had been a peace activist for the last 50 years.
Right, Ravi, because I think it's also relevant to remember Ellsberg's legacy today because there's a war going on thousands of miles away, and hence it becomes even more relevant to remember his legacy and his contribution. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode. Thank you. Death from sepsis of 5-month pregnant Dorota Lalik has pulled thousands of angry people into the streets in Poland. Poland has Europe's most restrictive abortion law. The changes came into force in the term of the Conservative government, which has been in power since 2015. A court ruling in 2021, when enacted into law, forbade abortions of fetuses even with severe deformities. Only pregnancies arising from rape and incest can be medically ended before full term. Lalik isn't the first victim of Poland's law, and Anna Wrasha from the People's Health Movement will tell us why even deaths haven't changed the lawmakers' hearts. Thanks for joining us today, Anna. So, first off, there are thousands who are protesting on the streets of Poland right now. But what explains this sort of a resistance from the government's end to change a law that's even causing death of women?
So essentially, the latest wave of protests that we have seen in Poland is the continuation of a wave of strikes, of women's strikes that have built up since 2020, when the Constitutional Court in Poland ruled against the right to abortion in case of fetal defects. This is the Polish abortion law has been one of the most conservative ones in Europe since 1993. It actually remains, of course, among those most conservative ones. And essentially, as you pointed out in the question, women have mobilized for a different abortion law. But on the other hand, you have this government which is heavily influenced by the Catholic Church, which is essentially, a very, very conservative and right-wing government, which will not allow for this to happen. And so what we are seeing now is that the law which they have voted and which they have implemented is actually leading to the death of women. The latest wave of protests was sparked by that of a pregnant woman at the end of May, who died of sepsis, and her family claimed that they were not informed that she might die because of the condition that she was admitted to in hospital. So this is not the first time that this has happened. In 2021, we have seen a similar case, and throughout this time, you hear stories from Polish women who are just very, very afraid of how they are being treated in the health system, and how the doctors are approaching them when it comes to reproductive health. So it has been one of the approaches of the government, let's put it that way, to essentially scare out the doctors in most of the cases. So they are not, they're even reluctant to provide abortion when the law permits, because they think that they'll face consequences. So it's a very bleak picture that women are facing in Poland. It has been so for quite a bit of time. So it has to be pointed out that throughout the past years, it hasn't been like they've given up. It's been a hard fight that Polish women have waged against the government. They've not backed away. So it's I think that in the coming weeks and months and years, probably, unfortunately, it's something that's going to continue along these lines. So it's just going to be a push for a better picture of reproductive and women's healthcare.
Right. Anna, can you also tell us something about what are the provisions of this law against abortion and what does it look like? Do you also think that the provisions have got stricter over the years?
Well, essentially, yes. So it's they have become stricter. If we take the example, very concrete one of 2020, when this provision, which allowed abortion in the case of fetal defects, was essentially struck out. It has been a very strict and conservative law to begin with. So if you look at how essentially it came into being, it was introduced in the early 1990s. What has happened since then is that the women's groups, the people's groups, have had less and less influence over what is included in the law, over how abortion is talked about. And on the other hand, you have this growing influence of the Catholic Church, non-relentlessly, essentially, because it's essentially, well, I wouldn't call it maybe a coalition, but it's a very strong alliance between state and church in Poland. And this heavily influences how this part of health is talked about. And it's important to point out that it's not only that it's being discussed in this way in policy circles. So it's not just the right-wing parties, the ruling Law and Justice Party who are talking about abortion in this way. It's also the right-wing civil society who come up with their own proposals for even stricter abortion care. So one that would make things even worse. And then on the other hand, of course, you have the church who's not shying away from talking about these things at mass. So it's it's reaching people throughout these different channels, and it's very difficult to escape. On the other hand, again, it has to be said that, since this thing started, so from the very beginnings, Polish women and women's groups have been quite stubborn in not giving up. So they've also said that, although the law has grown worse and worse over the years, they're now actually at a point in time when people in Poland know much more about reproductive healthcare and how abortions are performed, why abortions are performed, than they knew before. So it's actually had this double effect of permeating the society with a very conservative discourse. But on the other hand, you have the reaction, which is essentially one of resistance and trying to fight for something else.
Thank you for joining us today, Anna. We hope to be back with you again for another health update. As South Korea and the Philippines move closer to the US and Japan in the region, reports of the anti Beijing axis continue as the national security advisors of these countries meet on June 15 and 16. The meetings are intended to discuss regional security issues that include North Korea, South China Sea, as well as the East China Sea. However, increasing US posturing has not been equally received in all the quarters. On one hand, senators in Philippines are demanding that the United States pay for its presence in the country to help augment the pension funds of military and other uniformed personnel, while opposition members from South Korea are planning to visit China. Anish will join us now with more details on this story. Welcome back, Anish, to this show. And first off, what's happening with these meetings? We've talked about it in an earlier episode. What's so significant about these meetings between security advisors?
Well, I think the crucial aspect of these meetings is the fact that is who they're targeted against. Now, with the South Korean meeting, the target was definitely North Korea. The focus was, at least in their parlance, the focus was on North Korea, and the supposed nuclear test that is not. I mean, like it hasn't happened yet, but like which is being used by the United States as as a sort of a reason, as an excuse to further the already sanctioned and blockaded state of North Korea. So in this matter, obviously, you have very clear identification of your targets. But what is significant is that definitely China is becoming part of it, because what we have seen in previous statements that were released by US diplomats, officials, was that, and including South Korean officials, was that they are trying to blame China for whatever North Korea does. The whole point being that China somehow controls North Korea. I mean, it's not very explicitly stated, but we have seen multiple statements where the implicit or the insinuation is that somehow North Korea is controlled by the government in Beijing. And but it clearly shows the kind of direction such meetings like this. These are not new, especially with South Korea and the US, or South Korea and Japan. Trilateral meeting might be fairly new considering recent political developments, but definitely these show that like there is a very clear deal, because even earlier, even under conservative governments, previously, South Korea had never really tried to, antagonize or even, position China as a sort of aggressor, but it is doing right now. And now you're seeing the similar trend in Philippines, and we have talked about this under the Marcos Jr. administration. Obviously, the family, Marcos dynasty itself, always had a very anti-China, anti-communist, pro-US inclinations, politically speaking, which has only been doubled down upon under Marcos Jr.'s administration. What we have seen is like even though the Duterte administration, whatever said and done about his domestic policies, and when it came to foreign policy, and when it came to his government's stand on the US-China disputes that happened under his administration, the Philippines always kept itself away from it. It tried to be as neutral as possible. It tried to deal with both countries individually and not in terms of each other. And even though there were disputes with China, obviously there is a raging dispute in the South China Sea with China. The Philippines never really tried to, under Duterte, never really tried to bring in the United States as a sort of a balancing act, or maybe even like trying to create a heft for that matter. But Marcos Jr. definitely has expanded military bases in the US, and we are also seeing a very similar kind of trend in South Korea, where very recently the nuclear submarines everybody was talking about has reached the South Korean port yesterday. And obviously, there will be more kind of attempts by the South Korean government to expand access not only to the US military, but also to Japanese military, their former colonizers, with a very dark and very gory history of colonialism. But nevertheless, that is always being sidelined in this current pursuit of an anti-China alliance that we're seeing.
Thank you for that update, Anish. Thanks for joining us today. And that's all for today. For more such stories, keep watching Daily Debrief and also watch out our website peoplesdispatch.org. You can also follow us on our social media websites on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.